The Lincoln Tunnel opened to vehicular traffic in December 1937. It was engineered to carry cars and trucks beneath the Hudson River, connecting Weehawken, New Jersey to Midtown Manhattan. The tunnel was a triumph of American infrastructure during the Depression era, a solution to the bottleneck at the Holland Tunnel 5 miles south. What most people do not know is that the original design included provisions for rail service. What even fewer people know is that rail service was attempted, used briefly, and then abandoned. The records are sparse, the reasons are contested, and the infrastructure remains, sealed beneath layers of concrete and policy, inaccessible and unmapped in modern schematics. The initial plans, drawn up by the Port Authority in 1934, included a lower rail tube intended for commuter trains and freight. The concept was practical. Vehicular traffic would occupy the upper tubes. Trains would run beneath, carrying workers and goods during off-peak hours. This dual-purpose model had been studied in European tunnels. The engineering was sound. But by the time construction was complete, the rail tube had been deemed unnecessary. Official documents state that budget overruns and shifts in transit demand led to its decommissioning before operational use. But this is not entirely accurate. Between 1938 and 1941, a limited rail line operated inside the lower section of the Lincoln Tunnel complex. It was not advertised, it did not appear on public maps, it was used primarily for maintenance crews, equipment transport, and occasional freight delivery to underground facilities in Manhattan. The line ran on narrow-gauge track, powered by a third rail system and serviced by small electric locomotives pulling 2 or 3 cars at a time. Workers who operated the line referred to it simply as the service track. The Port Authority referred to it in internal memos as Line 7. There were no passengers in the conventional sense, only personnel. The tunnel environment was hostile. Ventilation in the rail tube was poor. The air was thick with diesel exhaust from the vehicular levels above, mixed with dampness and the metallic smell of the rails. The temperature fluctuated. In winter, condensation froze along the ceiling, forming icicles that occasionally fell onto the tracks. In summer, the heat became oppressive, and the humidity made breathing difficult. Lighting was minimal, consisting of single bulbs spaced every 50 feet. Between them, the tunnel was almost entirely dark. The sound of the trains echoed strangely, distorted by the curve of the walls and the density of the air. Workers reported that voices did not carry well. Shouting across the platform often went unheard. But mechanical sounds, the scrape of metal, the hum of the third rail, seemed amplified. There were no stations in the traditional sense. The rail line had 3 stops, one near the New Jersey entrance, one at the midpoint beneath the riverbed, and one at the Manhattan outlet. The midpoint stop was the most isolated. It was little more than a widened section of tunnel with a concrete platform and a ladder leading up to a maintenance hatch. The hatch connected to a vertical shaft that rose toward the vehicular tubes but did not reach them. It was a dead-end access point, used only in emergencies. The platform was always cold. Water dripped from the ceiling constantly. Workers avoided lingering there. By 1941, the rail line was used less frequently. Maintenance operations were consolidated. Freight services were rerouted. The trains ran perhaps once or twice a week, and then once a month. Personnel began to notice irregularities. Equipment left on the platform at the midpoint would be found displaced or missing. Tools vanished. On 3 occasions, the locomotive's headlamp was reported shattered, though no cause could be identified. Workers also reported difficulties with the third rail. Power outages occurred without explanation. On one occasion, in August 1941, a train became stranded at the midpoint for nearly 6 hours after the third rail lost power. The crew of 4 men had to wait in complete darkness until a backup generator could be brought down. One of them, a supervisor named Harold Voss, later filed a report stating that the men heard rhythmic tapping sounds coming from further down the tunnel during the blackout. He noted that the tapping seemed deliberate, as though someone was striking metal with a tool. No other personnel were in the tunnel at the time. In November 1941, the Port Authority issued an internal directive discontinuing all rail operations in the lower tube. The stated reason was operational inefficiency. The rail line was sealed at both ends using concrete barriers. The tracks were left in place. The locomotives and cars were removed and scrapped. The third rail was deactivated but not dismantled. Workers were reassigned. Documentation regarding the line was archived in a facility in Jersey City. Within 2 years, most references to the rail service had been removed from active Port Authority files. The sealing of the tunnel was not complete. Maintenance hatches remained accessible from the vehicular tubes, though they were rarely used. In the decades that followed, occasional inspection crews entered the lower tunnel to check for structural integrity. Their reports were brief and technical. They noted corrosion, water damage, and sections where the concrete had cracked. In a 1959 report, an inspector named Edmund Kraich mentioned that portions of the rail line appeared to have been disturbed. Sections of track had been pulled loose from their moorings. A rail car wheel was found lying in the center of the tunnel, more than 200 feet from where the cars had been stored before removal. Kraich noted that no maintenance activity had been authorized in that section since 1942. His report was filed and not followed up on. By the 1970s, the lower tunnel had been functionally forgotten. Modern engineers working on Lincoln Tunnel expansions were often unaware that the lower tube existed. Blueprints from that era either omitted the lower level or marked it as unused infrastructure. Security protocols did not include it. Ventilation systems did not service it. It became a void in the operational map of the tunnel, a space that existed physically but not administratively. And in that void, details accumulated that no one was tasked with investigating. Workers in the vehicular tubes occasionally reported anomalies. In 1973, a maintenance crew repairing a ventilation duct heard what they described as a low rumbling sound coming from below. It lasted for nearly a minute, then stopped. In 1981, a night crew reported a vibration that caused tools to rattle on their shelves. The vibration was felt across a 200-foot section of the northern tube, but seismic monitoring equipment detected nothing. In 1989, a toll booth operator reported seeing a brief flash of light in a maintenance shaft that was supposed to lead to a sealed section of the tunnel. Investigations into these events were minimal. The explanations offered were always mechanical: settling infrastructure, pressure changes, electrical faults. But there were other reports, less formal, passed between workers during shift changes. Stories of sounds that resembled trains, the distant clatter of wheels on rails heard late at night when traffic was lightest, the smell of burning coal, though no coal had been used in the tunnel since its construction, and occasionally the sense that something was moving in the sealed sections below, something that followed a schedule no one had authorized. The engineering specifications for the Lincoln Tunnel's lower rail section were based on designs used in the London Underground and the Paris Metro. The curve of the tunnel was calculated to allow trains to navigate the descent from New Jersey and the ascent into Manhattan without excessive speed loss. The gradient was carefully controlled, but the depth was unusual. At its lowest point, beneath the center of the Hudson River, the rail tube descended to nearly 170 feet below the surface. This was deeper than necessary for a commuter line. The depth was chosen to avoid interference with the vehicular tubes above and to ensure structural stability in the riverbed's softer sediment layers. But it also meant that the rail section was profoundly isolated. There were no adjacent tunnels at that depth, no sewer lines, no utility corridors. It was a singular void, separated from the rest of the city's infrastructure by bedrock and water. The isolation created problems during construction. Workers in the rail tube experienced higher rates of illness compared to those in the vehicular sections. Respiratory issues were common. Headaches and dizziness were frequently reported. The compressed air used to prevent water infiltration during excavation caused decompression sickness in several workers. 3 men died during the construction of the rail tube, 2 from accidents involving tunnel boring equipment, and 1 from what was recorded as a sudden cardiac event. The cardiac event occurred at the midpoint platform. The worker, a Croatian immigrant named Josip Markovic, collapsed without warning and could not be revived. An autopsy was not performed. He was buried in a municipal cemetery in Union City, New Jersey. His death was noted in Port Authority records as accidental, though no specific cause was identified. There were also delays. Excavation in the rail tube proceeded slower than in the vehicular sections. Workers reported encountering unexpected pockets of water and sections where the bedrock was softer than geological surveys had predicted. On 2 occasions, minor collapses occurred, requiring reinforcement and rerouting. These delays were not publicized. The rail tube was completed 9 months behind schedule, and by the time it was finished, the Port Authority had already begun to question its utility. The electric locomotives used in the tunnel were custom-built by a contractor in Pennsylvania. They were small, low-profile units designed to operate in confined spaces. Each locomotive weighed approximately 12 tons and was powered by a 600-volt third-rail system. The operator's cab was cramped with limited visibility. The controls were simple: a throttle, a brake lever, and a reverser. There were no windows on the sides, only a forward viewport reinforced with wire mesh. The locomotives had no horns. Instead, they were equipped with bells, which rang automatically when the train was in motion. The sound of the bells echoed through the tunnel in a way that workers described as disorienting. The echoes overlapped, creating a rhythm that did not match the actual speed of the train.
Personnel assigned to the rail line worked in rotating shifts. Most of them were mechanics or electricians, men with experience in underground systems. They were not train operators in the traditional sense. Their job was to transport equipment, monitor the third rail, and ensure that the tunnel remained passable. Shifts typically lasted 8 hours, though delays and mechanical issues sometimes extended them. The work was monotonous. The tunnel offered nothing to look at. The walls were bare concrete, occasionally marked with stenciled numbers indicating distance from the New Jersey entrance. The only variation was the slow curve of the tunnel as it descended and then rose again. The psychological effects of working in the tunnel were noted, but not formally studied. Workers reported difficulty sleeping. Some experienced vivid dreams involving water and darkness. A mechanic named Arthur Delmar, who worked on the line from 1939 to 1941, later told a reporter that the tunnel felt wrong. He could not describe it more precisely than that. He said the air was too still. The silence between trains was too complete. And there were moments, he said, when he felt certain that someone was standing just beyond the range of his flashlight, watching him. He never saw anyone, but the feeling persisted. In March 1940, an incident occurred that was not included in official reports. A locomotive transporting welding equipment became stuck at the midpoint platform. The third rail had lost power, a common issue. The crew, consisting of 3 men, attempted to diagnose the problem. While they were working, one of them, a man named Peter Gorski, claimed to hear footsteps. He said the footsteps were coming from the direction of the Manhattan end of the tunnel, moving toward them. The other 2 men heard nothing. Gorski insisted. He walked 20 feet down the tunnel with his flashlight and called out. There was no response. He returned to the platform. The power was restored 15 minutes later, and the crew completed their assignment. Gorski did not file a formal complaint, but he mentioned the incident to several co-workers. He was transferred to a different assignment 3 weeks later at his own request. The tapping sounds reported by Harold Voss and his crew in August 1941 were investigated informally. Another crew was sent into the tunnel to inspect the area where the sounds had been heard. They found nothing unusual: no loose equipment, no structural damage. The report concluded that the sounds were likely caused by thermal expansion in the rails or by water dripping onto metal surfaces. But the explanation did not account for the rhythm Voss had described. He had noted that the tapping came in groups of 3, followed by a pause, then repeated. He had counted 17 repetitions before it stopped. Thermal expansion does not follow a pattern. After the rail line was sealed in late 1941, access to the tunnel became irregular. Maintenance inspections were supposed to occur every 3 years, but records show that many scheduled inspections were postponed or canceled. The lower tunnel was considered low priority. There was no active infrastructure to maintain. The vehicular cubes above required constant attention, and resources were limited. Between 1942 and 1958, only 4 documented inspections of the sealed rail section took place.
The reports from these inspections were brief. They noted the expected deterioration, rust, water pooling, minor cracks in the concrete. But in the 1951 inspection, the crew reported finding a section of track that had been moved. The rails had been shifted approximately 3 feet to the left, warping the ties beneath them. The crew could not determine how this had happened. Heavy equipment would have been required. No such equipment had been in the tunnel since the line was sealed. The 1959 inspection, conducted by Edmund Krajcik, produced the most detailed report. Krajcik spent nearly 6 hours in the tunnel, longer than any previous inspector. He noted extensive corrosion on the third rail and damage to several support beams, but he also noted anomalies. In addition to the displaced railcar wheel, he found a section of the tunnel where the lighting fixtures had been removed. The bulbs and their housings were gone, leaving only empty sockets. He also found what he described as markings on the wall near the midpoint platform. The markings were scratches, forming rough vertical lines. Krajcik counted 23 lines, grouped in sets of 5. He did not speculate on their origin. He photographed them, and the photographs were included in his report. The report was filed in the Port Authority's archive. The photographs have since been lost. By the 1960s, the existence of the sealed rail tunnel was known only to a small number of engineers and administrative staff. It was not discussed publicly. It did not appear in promotional materials or historical summaries of the Lincoln Tunnel. When expansions and upgrades were planned, the lower tunnel was simply marked as void space on blueprints. In practical terms, it had been erased. But erasure does not mean absence. In 1977, a proposal was made to reopen the lower tunnel for use as a utility corridor. The idea was to run fiber optic cables and water mains through the sealed rail section, taking advantage of the existing infrastructure. A survey team was sent to assess the tunnel's condition. The team consisted of 2 engineers, Frank Oleska and David Margolis, and a Port Authority supervisor named Leonard Kahn. They entered the tunnel through a maintenance hatch in the northern vehicular tube on a Sunday morning in October. The tunnel had been sealed for 36 years. The team descended a metal ladder into the lower section. The air was cold and damp. Their flashlights revealed walls covered in mineral deposits and patches of black mold. The concrete was intact, but large sections were discolored by water seepage. The rails were heavily rusted. In some places, the rust had fused the rails to the concrete bed beneath them. The team moved slowly, documenting the condition of the tunnel with photographs and measurements. They progressed approximately 500 feet before Margolis reported hearing a sound. He described it as a low metallic groan, similar to the sound of a train braking. Oleska and Kahn did not hear it. Margolis insisted. They stopped and listened. The tunnel was silent. They continued. At the midpoint platform, the team paused to rest. Kahn noted that the platform was unusually clean. There was no debris, no significant accumulation of dust. The walls showed the same water damage and mold seen elsewhere, but the floor of the platform appeared to have been swept. Kahn mentioned this in his notes, but did not consider it significant at the time. The team spent 20 minutes on the platform, eating sandwiches and reviewing their progress. Margolis reported feeling watched. He said it was a strong sensation, as though someone was standing in the tunnel just beyond the reach of their lights. Oleska dismissed the comment. Kahn did not respond. As they prepared to leave, Oleska noticed something near the edge of the platform. It was a cigarette butt. The butt was not fresh, but it was not old enough to have been there since 1941. Oleska picked it up with a gloved hand and placed it in a plastic bag. He did not mention it to the others until they had returned to the surface. When he did, Kahn ordered him to dispose of it. Kahn told him that maintenance crews occasionally access the tunnel without filing formal entry logs. He said the cigarette was not relevant to their survey. Oleska disposed of it. He later told a colleague that he did not believe Kahn's explanation. No maintenance crews had been in that tunnel in years. The survey team's report recommended against using the lower tunnel as a utility corridor. The cost of repairs and ventilation upgrades would exceed the cost of drilling a new tunnel. The proposal was abandoned. The lower tunnel remained sealed. In 1983, a crew of transit workers illegally entered the sealed rail section. They were urban explorers, men in their 20s who had obtained a stolen key to one of the maintenance hatches. They brought cameras and flashlights. They intended to photograph the abandoned tunnel and document what they called a forgotten piece of New York history. 4 men entered the tunnel on a Friday night in June. They descended into the lower section and began walking toward the midpoint. They took photographs of the rusted rails, the decaying walls, and the old third rail system. One of them, a man named Robert Kasdan, recorded audio on a cassette recorder. The group reached the midpoint platform after approximately 40 minutes. Kasdan's recording captures their conversation. They discussed the condition of the tunnel and speculated about why it had been sealed. One of them joked about ghosts. Another mentioned the tapping sounds reported in old Port Authority memos, which he had read about in a library archive. The conversation continued for several minutes. Then the recording captures a new sound. It is faint but distinct, the sound of a bell ringing. The bell rings 3 times, then stops. The men fall silent. One of them asks if anyone else heard it. They all confirm that they did. The bell rings again, this time closer. The recording becomes chaotic. The men are moving quickly, their voices overlapping. Kasdan is breathing heavily. The recording ends abruptly.
The 4 men exited the tunnel and did not return. Kasdan kept the recording but did not make it public until 2003, when he uploaded it to an early urban exploration forum. By then, 2 of the other men who had been with him had died, one from cancer and one from a car accident. Kasdan refused to discuss the incident in detail. He said only that they had heard the bell and that they had felt an overwhelming need to leave. He described the feeling as instinctual, as though their bodies understood something their minds did not. The recording was analyzed by several audio enthusiasts. The bell sound was confirmed to be genuine, not a later addition or artifact of the recording equipment. Its source could not be identified. Some listeners noted that the bell's tone matched the tone of the bells used on the old electric locomotives that had operated in the tunnel, but those locomotives had been scrapped in 1942. In 1991, a transit authority employee named Gerald Fisk reported an incident that occurred during routine maintenance in the northern vehicular tube. Fisk was part of a crew repairing a ventilation fan near the ceiling of the tunnel. The work required him to enter a narrow crawl space that ran parallel to the vehicular tube. While inside the crawl space, Fisk heard what he described as a train moving beneath him. He said the sound was clear: wheels on rails, the hum of an electric motor, and the rhythmic clanging of a bell. The sound lasted for approximately 30 seconds, then stopped. Fisk radioed his supervisor and reported the sound. The supervisor told him that no trains operated in that section of the tunnel. Fisk insisted. The supervisor sent another crew member into the crawl space to verify. The second crew member heard nothing. Fisk completed his work and returned to the surface. He filed a formal report. The report was marked as unsubstantiated and filed. Fisk continued working for the Transit Authority for another 6 years. He refused assignments that required him to work near the Northern Tube. In 1997, he transferred to a different facility. In an interview conducted years later, Fisk said that he knew what he had heard. He said the sound had been so clear that he could distinguish individual details: the squeal of the wheels on a curve, the slight variation in the bell's rhythm as the train accelerated. He said he had no doubt that a train had been moving beneath him. He also said that he believed the train had no operator. Between 1995 and 2004, 3 separate incidents were reported by drivers in the Lincoln Tunnel. Each driver claimed to have seen a figure standing in one of the emergency alcoves that line the vehicular tubes. The figure was described as wearing dark clothing, possibly a uniform.
In each case, the driver slowed down or stopped to offer assistance, but the figure was gone by the time they reached the alcove. None of the drivers could explain how the figure had disappeared. The alcoves are shallow and offer no place to hide. Security footage reviewed after these incidents showed no evidence of anyone in the alcoves at the reported times. In one case, a driver named Monica Halford reported that the figure had been standing at the entrance to a maintenance door. She said the door was open, which was unusual. She saw the figure step through the door and descend out of sight. When Port Authority security checked the door later, it was locked. The door led to a stairwell that descended to the lower levels of the tunnel complex. The stairwell had not been used in years. Security logs showed no record of the door being opened. The most detailed account came from a truck driver named William Dern, who was driving through the tunnel late on a February night in 2004. Dern reported that he saw a man standing in an alcove near the center of the northern tube. The man was facing the wall. Dern slowed his truck and activated his hazard lights. As he approached, the man turned. Dern said the man's face was pale, expressionless. The man raised one hand as though signaling Dern to stop. Dern stopped. The man stepped out of the alcove and walked toward the side of the tunnel, toward a section of wall where there was no door. Dern said the man placed his hand on the wall and then passed through it, as though the wall were not there. Dern sat in his truck for several minutes, unable to process what he had seen. He eventually drove on. He did not report the incident until 3 weeks later, and only then to a friend. The friend convinced him to contact the Port Authority. By the time Dern made the call, he was uncertain about the details. He said he might have been tired. He said he might have imagined it, but he also said that he would never drive through the Lincoln Tunnel again, and he never did. The Port Authority conducted an internal review of anomalous reports related to the Lincoln Tunnel in 2006. The review was not made public. It was initiated after a series of maintenance issues in the northern tube, including repeated failures of ventilation fans and unexplained power fluctuations. The review included interviews with current and former employees, analysis of incident reports dating back to the 1970s, and a limited physical inspection of the lower tunnel. The inspection team entered through the same maintenance hatch used by the 1977 survey team. They documented the condition of the rail section and noted that it had deteriorated significantly since the last inspection. But they also noted something that had not been documented before. At the midpoint platform, the inspection team found evidence of recent activity. The platform's surface showed scuff marks consistent with foot traffic. The marks were not old. The team also found a piece of cloth, dark blue, possibly from a work uniform. The cloth was sent to a lab for analysis. The analysis determined that the fabric was consistent with materials used in Port Authority uniforms in the 1940s. But the fabric showed no significant aging. It was not brittle. It had not faded. The lab report noted this as an anomaly, but offered no explanation. The cloth was logged as evidence and stored in a Port Authority facility in Newark. It was later lost during a facility reorganization in 2011. The 2006 review concluded that the anomalous reports were likely the result of misperception, fatigue, and the psychological effects of working in an enclosed, underground environment. The review recommended improved lighting in the vehicular tubes and more frequent mental health evaluations for tunnel workers. It did not recommend further investigation of the lower rail section. The review was filed and classified as internal only. Employees who had provided testimony for the review were instructed not to discuss their statements publicly. But the reports did not stop. In 2009, a transit supervisor named Ellen Ritchie reported hearing a voice while conducting an inspection in the southern tube. She said the voice was male, speaking a language she did not recognize. The voice was faint, as though coming from a great distance. Ritchie stopped and tried to locate the source. She could not. The voice continued for approximately 2 minutes, then stopped. Ritchie completed her inspection and filed a report. The report was noted and archived. In 2012, a construction crew working on a seismic reinforcement project in the northern tube broke through a section of concrete that was not marked on any blueprint. Behind the concrete, they found a narrow corridor, approximately 4 feet wide and 7 feet high. The corridor extended for approximately 50 feet before terminating in a sealed door. The door was made of steel and had no visible handle or lock. The crew reported the discovery to their supervisor. The supervisor contacted the Port Authority. An engineering team was dispatched to investigate. The team examined the door and determined that it had been welded shut from the inside. The corridor did not appear on any existing schematic of the tunnel. Its purpose could not be determined. The Port Authority ordered the corridor sealed again. The construction crew poured concrete over the entrance, and the project continued. No further investigation was conducted.
The sealed door was never opened, but one member of the engineering team, a man named Thomas Lefko, later stated that he had placed his hand on the door while examining it. He said the metal was warm. He said he had felt a vibration, faint but steady, as though something was running on the other side. He did not mention this in his official report. He mentioned it years later in a private conversation after he had retired. He said he had not wanted to seem irrational, but he also said that he had not imagined it. The door was warm, and something was moving behind it. In 2018, a journalist named Amanda Vickers began researching the history of the Lincoln Tunnel's lower rail section. She filed multiple Freedom of Information requests with the Port Authority, seeking access to archival documents, inspection reports, and incident logs. Most of her requests were denied. The Port Authority stated that many of the requested documents had been lost, destroyed, or were not subject to public disclosure. Vickers was able to obtain a small number of heavily redacted reports. Among them was the 1959 report by Edmund Cryucci. The report had been scanned and digitized, but the photographs Cryucci had taken were missing. Vickers contacted retired Port Authority employees and was able to interview 3 individuals who had worked in or near the tunnel during the 1970s and 1980s. All 3 confirmed that they had heard stories about the sealed rail section. All 3 described a culture of silence regarding the lower tunnel. They said that workers who reported unusual experiences were discouraged from filing formal complaints. They said that the tunnel was considered unlucky. Vickers attempted to enter the lower tunnel herself, but was denied access by the Port Authority. She was told that the tunnel was structurally unsafe and that unauthorized entry was prohibited. She published an article about her research in 2019. The article received limited attention. The Port Authority did not respond to requests for comment. Vickers continued her research but was unable to obtain additional information. She has stated that she believes the Port Authority is withholding significant documentation regarding the tunnel. She has also stated that she believes something occurred in the lower rail section that has never been adequately explained. The lower tunnel remains sealed. It is not included in public tours of the Lincoln Tunnel. It is not discussed in official histories. Modern engineers working on tunnel maintenance are often unaware of its existence. The blueprints used for current operations either omit the rail section entirely or mark it as void space. There are no plans to reopen it. There are no plans to demolish it. It exists in a state of administrative non-existence, a physical space that has been functionally erased from the operational and historical record. But the reports continue. Workers in the vehicular tubes still hear sounds they cannot explain. Drivers still see figures in the alcoves. And late at night, when traffic is lightest and the tunnel is quiet, there are those who say they can hear it, the distant sound of a bell ringing in the darkness, marking the passage of a train that no longer exists, carrying passengers who were never recorded, traveling a route that no map acknowledges. The lower tunnel is still there, beneath the river, beneath the traffic, beneath the light. And whatever moves through it moves alone, following a schedule written in rust and silence, in water and shadow, in the unmarked hours between the last train and the first. The Port Authority does not comment, the records do not explain, and the tunnel waits, patient and cold, for the next shift to begin.